When World War I ended, the armies of the world drew one brutal lesson. The rifleman was dying. Machine guns, artillery, and poison gas had ruled the trenches, and nations believed that individual marksmanship no longer mattered. Yet in the United States, a quiet revolution was already beginning inside the gray stone walls of the Springfield Armory in Massachusetts. There, among the clang of hammers and the smell of oil and steel, an immigrant engineer named John C. Garand was about to change the future of warfare with a single idea: that one man, with one rifle, could fire faster than an entire squad if given the right weapon. Garand was not a soldier. He was a machinist, a French-Canadian by birth who had moved to the United States as a boy, fascinated by precision and motion. In the 1920s, while the rest of the army still worshipped the bolt-action Springfield M1903, Garand began working on a radical design, a semi-automatic rifle that would use the energy of each fired bullet to load the next one automatically. In theory, it would double a soldier's rate of fire without increasing his workload. In practice, it was considered impossible. At the time, every other nation's attempts at self-loading rifles had failed. They jammed, overheated, or shattered under battlefield stress. Ammunition was inconsistent, machining was crude. But Garand refused to give up. For nearly a decade, he tinkered and redesigned, working with experimental calibers, gas ports, and recoil systems. The first prototypes were chambered for the .276 Peterson cartridge, a smaller round with less recoil. The Army's Ordnance Department loved the idea until the Chief of Staff, General Douglas MacArthur, intervened. In 1932, with Depression-era budgets tightening, MacArthur ordered that all future rifles use the existing .30-06 Springfield ammunition to save costs. Overnight, Garand had to redesign his weapon from scratch. He did it in less than a year. The new rifle was heavier, yes, but it worked flawlessly. Its gas-operated mechanism tapped the pressure from each shot to push a piston, cycle the bolt, and chamber the next round. No bolt handle to lift, no pause between shots. The shooter simply squeezed the trigger again. For the first time, an infantryman could fire as fast as he could aim. In 1936, after nearly 2 decades of experiments and bureaucracy, the U.S. Army officially adopted the weapon as the United States Rifle Caliber 30 M1, the M1 Garand. It became the first semi-automatic rifle ever standardized for general issue by any army on Earth. When news of the weapon reached Europe, foreign observers were skeptical, even dismissive. The British War Office called it too complicated for field use. German ordnance officers scoffed that a self-loading rifle would waste ammunition and discipline. And among the American Old Guard, there was still resistance. Many officers believed that rapid fire would encourage poor accuracy, that soldiers would become lazy and reckless. The rifleman's art is patience, not speed. But time was changing faster than tradition could follow. By the late 1930s, as the world edged toward another war, Garand's creation was being produced in quantity at Springfield and Winchester. The first soldiers to test it reported something extraordinary. It simply did not fail. Rain, mud, sand, nothing seemed to stop it. And when fired, its 8-round en-bloc clip popped free with a sharp metallic ping, a sound that would soon echo across every battlefield of World War II. The men who fired it in training couldn't stop smiling. Sergeant Charles Luther, one of the earliest recruits to use the Garand at Fort Benning, recalled later, "It was like holding lightning in your hands. You didn't think. You aimed, you fired, and it just kept going." For the first time, the United States infantryman was equipped not with a relic of the trenches, but with a glimpse of the future. In Garand's hands, the simple rifle had evolved into a machine of precision and reliability, a weapon that gave every soldier the firepower of 2. The irony was that few in Washington truly understood what they had. Production remained slow. Political delays and budget cuts meant that on the eve of World War II, many U.S. units were still using old bolt-action Springfields. Yet those who had the Garand knew they held something different, something that might tilt the balance of war itself. John C. Garand, who had spent half his life being told that his design would never work, stood quietly beside the first production line in 1937 as the rifles rolled out one after another. A journalist asked him what he thought of his creation. He simply smiled and said, "It's not mine anymore. It belongs to the soldier now." No one, not Garand, not the army, not even the men who would one day carry it up the beaches of Normandy, could yet grasp the full weight of what had been born in that factory. The M1 Garand was not just a rifle. It was the heartbeat of a coming storm, a weapon built for a generation about to face the most mechanized war in history. And soon, the world would learn what happened when that heartbeat echoed across the fields of Europe.
By the late 1930s, the M1 Garand had moved from prototype to production, its lines of walnut and steel now rolling out of the Springfield armoring at a steady pace. To the men who trained with it, it felt like holding progress itself, balanced, powerful, and almost alive. Yet to outsiders, it looked strange, even impractical. It had no traditional bolt handle, no magazine you could see, and it made a curious metallic ping when the clip ejected after the 8th shot. To the old-world militaries of Europe, that noise was proof that Americans had built something foolish. To the men who carried it, that same sound was the anthem of modern war. The Garand's genius lay in its simplicity. Its gas-operated, rotating bolt system meant each bullet's explosion powered the next shot. The soldier needed only to aim and pull the trigger. 8 rounds fired in seconds, each one accurate, each one ready without the pause and clatter of a bolt-action reload. Compared to the German Karabiner 98K, the Wehrmacht's standard rifle, the difference was night and day. A trained German soldier could fire perhaps 15 rounds per minute. A calm American rifleman with the Garand could unleash more than 40, each one backed by the power of the 30-06 cartridge, a round capable of punching through walls, helmets, and even light armor. But power came at a cost. The rifle was heavier, weighing nearly 9.5 pounds loaded, and it required careful machining, the kind of industrial precision only America's factories could sustain. It was not as simple to strip and clean as a bolt action, and the en-bloc clip, though revolutionary, had quirks. When empty, it was automatically ejected with that signature ping, a small, ringing note that would become one of the most recognizable sounds of the Second World War. Soldiers joked about it endlessly. "That's the dinner bell," they said. "Tells Jerry we're empty." This myth, that German soldiers could hear the ping and rush an American while he reloaded, spread through the ranks and persisted for decades. But those who fought in the mud and smoke knew better. In real combat, the battlefield was never silent. Bullets cracked overhead, mortars thundered, and machine guns chattered without pause. No German ear could pick out one tiny metallic ping amid the chaos. In truth, the sound was less a weakness than a heartbeat, a reminder that the rifle was doing its job perfectly, cycling clean, feeding smooth, and never jamming. The strengths of the Garand were as clear as daylight. It was devastatingly fast. Its accuracy was remarkable even at long ranges. The recoil was manageable, the balance steady, and it worked in nearly every environment: desert, jungle, snow, or sea spray. Unlike automatic weapons that overheated or jammed, the Garand's semi-automatic rhythm made it reliable, a perfect marriage of human control and mechanical efficiency. But perhaps its greatest strength wasn't in the steel or the gas system. It was in how it changed the psychology of the soldier. For generations, infantrymen had been trained to fire, pause, bolt, and fire again, always aware of their limits. The Garand shattered that rhythm. It gave every rifleman a sense of power and momentum that matched his courage. "You didn't just fight with it, you fought through it," one veteran later said. Still, there were skeptics. Some officers worried that soldiers would spray and pray, wasting ammunition. Others feared maintenance issues in the field. Early versions suffered from minor flaws: weak extractors, worn gas cylinders, or bent operating rods. But every flaw was corrected through relentless testing. By 1940, The Garand had proven itself in thousands of field trials. Even General George S. Patton, then an armored commander known for his harsh critiques, declared after a demonstration, "In my opinion, the M1 rifle is the greatest battle implement ever devised." It wasn't just a compliment, it was prophecy. By 1941, the first large-scale shipments reached the U.S. Army and Marine Corps. As tensions with Japan and Germany escalated, the rifle that once faced skepticism now symbolized American readiness. Across the Atlantic, British and German analysts continued to underestimate it. One German intelligence report from 1941 described it as a complex semi-automatic rifle of questionable reliability. Another mocked its weight and the wasteful rate of fire unsuited to disciplined troops. They would soon regret that judgment. For all its quirks, the weight, the ping, the mechanical complexity, the M1 Garand was a masterpiece of balance. It embodied everything America was about to bring to the war: industrial innovation, reliability, and overwhelming firepower. By the time of Pearl Harbor in December 1941, nearly 250,000 Garands were in the hands of U.S. soldiers and Marines. On the training grounds of Georgia and the Pacific Islands, the ping had become part of the soundscape of war. Recruits learned to reload blindfolded, to fire from the hip, to feel the recoil and the rhythm like a heartbeat. They didn't know it yet, but in a few short months, that heartbeat would echo across Africa, Sicily, and finally the beaches of France, where German soldiers would learn the hard way that the ping gun wasn't a weakness at all. It was the sound of a new kind of soldier who didn't pause, didn't yield, and didn't stop firing.
The first time the M1 Garand met the enemy, it was not in Europe or on a Pacific island. It was under the burning sun of North Africa. On November 8, 1942, the United States launched Operation Torch, its first major offensive of World War II. Over 100,000 American and British troops landed on the coasts of Morocco and Algeria, facing Vichy French defenders and, soon after, the battle-hardened veterans of Germany's Afrika Korps. For many American soldiers, this was their baptism by fire, and the Garand was their only companion. When the first volleys echoed across the desert, the difference between American and German firepower became instantly clear. The Karabiner 98K rifles carried by the Wehrmacht were accurate but slow. Each shot required a deliberate motion: lift the bolt, pull it back, chamber a new round, push forward, lock, aim, and fire again. A good German marksman might get off 15 rounds a minute, but the Garand could fire 3 times that, with each squeeze of the trigger delivering a new, thundering shot. The rhythm of battle had changed. Reports from the front stunned Allied commanders. Entire American rifle squads were putting out as much firepower as German platoons. One Wehrmacht officer, captured during the Tunisia campaign, described the shock. "They fired so fast we thought they had automatic rifles. We couldn't lift our heads. Their bullets came like rain." For the Americans, it was validation of Garand's genius. Soldiers quickly realized that their new rifle wasn't just a tool, it was an equalizer. Against German veterans with years of combat experience, the Garand gave raw American recruits a fighting chance. Sergeant William G. Whittle of the 1st Infantry Division later said, "That rifle saved more of us than we'll ever know. When they popped up on a ridge, you didn't think, you just fired. 8 rounds, bam, 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 and they were gone." But the desert was unforgiving, and the Garand faced its first true test. The fine dust and sand of North Africa could choke engines, jam guns, and blind men. Yet the M1's sealed gas system held strong. It required care, but when kept clean, it kept firing. American maintenance crews quickly learned to tape over the rifle's muzzle during sandstorms and use special lubricants to prevent grit from binding the action. Even so, the weapon performed far better than many had feared. By early 1943, as the Allies pushed east through Tunisia,
German commanders began noting the Garand in their intelligence reports. It appeared in intercepted documents as a new American semi-automatic rifle of high firepower. The Luftwaffe's ground divisions, unaccustomed to such rapid small arms fire, were shocked by how quickly U.S. infantry could establish base of fire superiority. Machine gunners who once dominated open ground suddenly found themselves pinned by riflemen. In March 1943, during the Battle of El Guetar, the Garand's effectiveness reached new heights. Facing off against elements of the 10th Panzer Division, the U.S. 1st Infantry Division fought tooth and nail through Tunisia's rocky hills. The Germans launched armored assaults supported by 88mm guns and infantry storm groups, classic blitzkrieg tactics, but each time the Americans, anchored by their Garands and supported by 105mm howitzers, poured out walls of lead that shredded the advancing troops. What should have been a rout became a stand. The men of the Big Red One held their ground, their rifles glowing hot in their hands. The psychological effect was just as important as the tactical one. The Wehrmacht had built its reputation on speed, precision, and discipline, an army of veterans who believed no force could match them in fieldcraft or fire. But in the dusty valleys of Tunisia, they met something new, a mass army that could shoot back faster than they could move. A German after-action report lamented, "The Americans are well armed with a semi-automatic rifle. Their fire is accurate and continuous. Closing with them is costly." From North Africa, the Garand followed the Allies into Sicily, Operation Husky, in July 1943. There, amid olive groves and ancient ruins, it proved itself again. Soldiers of the 82nd Airborne carried it during night drops. Marines wielded it on the beaches. In close quarters fighting among the stone villages, the Garand's rapid fire turned ambushes into chaos for Axis defenders. One paratrooper from the 505th Paratrooper Infantry Regiment described it vividly. You'd hit the ground, roll, and the rifle was already barking. You didn't wait, you didn't think, you just pulled and it kept going. That sound, that ping, it was the rhythm of the fight. In the hands of the American infantry, the Garand was transforming the doctrine of ground warfare. The bolt-action era was ending. The Germans began to respond, introducing the Sturmgewehr 44, the world's first true assault rifle, in 1943. But it came too late, in too few numbers. For now, the battlefield belonged to the men with Garands. By the end of 1943, as the Allies fought their way up the Italian peninsula, the reputation of the ping gun had reached legendary status. It was no longer a curiosity or an experiment. It was the symbol of American firepower, the weapon that made every soldier a machine gunner. From the sands of El Guetar to the slopes of Monte Cassino, the Garand spoke with one voice: fast, relentless, unstoppable. John Garand himself, far from the front lines, continued refining his design in Springfield. When asked what he thought of the reports from Africa, he replied humbly, "It's not the rifle that wins the war, it's the men who use it." Perhaps, but those men were winning because of his rifle. The dawn of June 6, 1944, broke gray and cold over the English Channel. Below the roaring sky, the largest invasion fleet in human history churned toward the beaches of Normandy. More than 5,000 ships and landing craft carried 156,000 men, Americans, British, and Canadians, bound for Hitler's fortress Europe. Among them, packed tight in the holds of Higgins boats, were the riflemen of the U.S. 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions. Each man gripped the same weapon, the M1 Garand. It was heavy in their hands, cold against their palms, but to those soldiers, it was comfort, a machine they trusted with their lives. They called it the greatest friend you'll ever have. And when the ramps dropped and hell opened around them, that friendship was tested in the crucible of Omaha Beach. German machine guns raked the surf, cutting down men before they reached the sand. Mortars exploded in the shallows. Tanks sank. The first waves were chaos, bodies, wreckage, and fire. But amid that storm, the Garands kept firing. The semi-automatic rhythm of the rifles, crack, 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 became the pulse of survival. Soldiers fired prone in the surf, their rifles half submerged, sand grinding in the actions, salt water in the barrels, and still the weapons fired. Technical reports from the invasion later noted that the M1 Garand was one of the few firearms that functioned reliably in the corrosive salt and grit of the Normandy landings. The Germans, armed mostly with bolt-action Kar 98K rifles, couldn't believe the sheer volume of American fire. It was like fighting a wall of bullets, one captured Obergefreiter later recalled. You would fire once, and they fired 5 times back. At Pointe du Hoc, Rangers scaled cliffs under machine gun fire, Garands slung over their shoulders. At Utah Beach, paratroopers of the 101st and 82nd Airborne fired them from hedgerows and farmhouses, turning ambushes into massacres. And on Omaha, where chaos reigned, the rifle became the anchor of every desperate push forward. Lieutenant John Spaulding of the 16th Infantry recalled the moment his men broke through a concrete seawall. We were outnumbered, pinned by MG-42s. I remember thinking we'd never get across that stretch. Then one of my guys stood up, firing his Garand so fast it sounded like an automatic. He dropped 3 Germans before they could reload. We all got up and followed him. That's how we made it off the beach. By nightfall, the beachhead was secure, at an unthinkable cost. But the M1 Garand had proven itself beyond any doubt. The rifle that foreign observers once mocked as too complex had just stormed the gates of Europe. In the weeks that followed, as the Allies advanced through the Normandy hedgerows, the Garand became both sword and shield. The tight, green labyrinth of bocage country turned every field into a killing ground. German snipers dug into tree lines, waited for the telltale ping, but they waited in vain. American soldiers learned to fire in pairs, one reloading while the other covered. The so-called weakness of the Garand became a myth, shattered by discipline and teamwork. In the hedgerows near Saint-Lô, German soldiers began calling the M1 the Achtschussgewehr, the 8-shot rifle. They feared it. Reports from Wehrmacht intelligence noted that American riflemen possess a weapon superior in firepower to our standard arms. Engagements at short and medium range are unfavorable. The contrast between the two armies' weapons could not have been starker. The German Kar 98K was a masterpiece of precision craftsmanship, but it belonged to another era. Its 5-round magazine and manual operation simply could not match the storm of fire the Garand unleashed. And while the Wehrmacht had begun deploying ST-44 assault rifles in limited numbers, they were too few, too late. By August 1944, as the Allies liberated Paris, the Garand had become more than a weapon. It was an icon. It had carried the American infantry from the beaches to the hedgerows, from chaos to victory. Wherever American soldiers went, Normandy, Cherbourg, Saint-Lô, Falaise, the crack of the Garand followed, echoing through towns and across fields. The rifle's 8-round clip, loaded with a metallic snap, became the sound of inevitability to the Germans, a warning that the tide of war had turned. When Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was later debriefed after the war, he admitted that the Allies' air power and logistics were overwhelming, but he added something remarkable. Their infantry weapons were excellent. Their rifle, the Garand, was especially fast and gave the individual soldier an advantage. Back home, American newspapers called it the rifle that won the war. But the soldiers who carried it never spoke with such grandeur. To them, it was simply the tool that kept them alive. You could trust that rifle more than you could trust your luck. You'd squeeze the trigger and it would answer you every time. By the fall of 1944, as Allied armies crossed into Germany, the Garand had established itself as the gold standard of infantry rifles. The soldiers of the Wehrmacht,
once confident in their training and technology, now faced an opponent whose basic rifle was a generation ahead. In a war dominated by tanks, planes, and artillery, the M1 Garand reminded the world that battles were still won by the men on the ground and by the weapon in their hands. It was not a marvel of engineering alone. It was the embodiment of an industrial giant's will to arm its sons with the very best. And as the bitter winter of 1944 approached, that rifle would march into its hardest test yet, the frozen forests of the Ardennes, where it would once again prove that speed, strength, and steel could defy even the deadliest ambush.
The winter of 1944 fell like a hammer on Europe. Snow smothered the forests of the Ardennes, and the wind cut through uniforms and skin alike. The men who had landed in Normandy now trudged through sleet and fog, exhausted but determined. Hitler had launched his last great gamble, the Battle of the Bulge, a surprise counteroffensive that slammed into the thin American lines on December 16th. It was a fight for survival, waged in frozen foxholes and ruined villages. And in those desperate days, the M1 Garand once again proved that it was more than just a weapon. It was the lifeline of an army. The fog was so thick that soldiers sometimes didn't see the enemy until they were only a few yards apart. German tanks rolled through the woods, their machine guns tearing through snowdrifts. American supply lines broke down, radios froze, and men fought until their rifles literally turned white with frost. Yet the Garand kept firing. Its gas-operated system, designed to run cleanly even under grime, withstood conditions that seized the bolts of many German rifles solid. At Bastogne, surrounded and outnumbered, the 101st Airborne Division used their Garands to hold off wave after wave of attacks. One sergeant remembered the sound, sharp, relentless, rhythmic, echoing through the trees. You could tell where our boys were by the sound of the rifles. Even when we were cut off, you could hear the Garands talking. When the snow cleared and Patton's tanks finally broke through to relieve the defenders, the field was littered with empty en-bloc clips, each one a testament to the willpower that had held the line. The rifle's reputation by 1945 was beyond question. From the deserts of North Africa to the hedgerows of France, from Sicily's beaches to Belgium's forests, the Garand had armed an entire generation of Americans. The Germans no longer mocked it. In fact, they feared it. Captured Garands were often turned against their former owners, so prized were they for their speed and dependability. The Luftwaffe's ground units and the Waffen-SS coveted them, and even after the war, European armies sought to model their post-war rifles on its design. When the war ended, General George S. Patton's praise of the rifle became legend. In my opinion, the M1 rifle is the greatest battle implement ever devised. It wasn't hyperbole. The Garand had done something no other rifle had done before. It had mechanized the infantryman. It took America's industrial genius and put it directly in the hands of its soldiers. Each rifle was a masterpiece of mass production, built with interchangeable parts that any factory worker could assemble. More than 5.4 million were produced between 1936 and 1945, a number unmatched by any other semi-automatic battle rifle of the era. As peace returned, the Garand did not fade into history. It fought again in Korea, where it proved invaluable in the freezing mountains and muddy valleys. Marines at Chosin Reservoir carried it through temperatures so low that oil froze solid, and still it fired. Against waves of Chinese infantry, the Garand's rapid fire kept small American units alive against impossible odds. Its 8-round clips echoed through the valleys just as they had across Europe, a sound that enemy soldiers began to call the American drumbeat. Even as new rifles emerged, the M14, the M16, the Garand spirit remained. It became the foundation of modern military small arms, gas-operated, semi-automatic, reliable under pressure. Nations across the world adopted versions of it, from Italy's BM-59 to Canada's C-1 Garand, and even post-war Japan's experimental models. Its influence stretched into the design of nearly every Western battle rifle of the 20th century. But its legacy was not only mechanical. The M1 Garand became a symbol of the citizen soldier, the ordinary man who became extraordinary through courage and technology. It represented an America that believed innovation could serve freedom, that precision could be a moral weapon. The rifle's perfection lay not in its engineering alone, but in what it enabled: unity, momentum, and the ability to fight back even when the odds seemed hopeless. At the National D-Day Memorial in Bedford, Virginia, there stands a statue of a young American infantryman charging forward, rifle in hand. The sculpted weapon is unmistakable: the long stock, the gas cylinder, the fixed bayonet lug of the Garand. It represents not just a rifle, but an era, the sound of liberation, the heartbeat of victory. Decades later, collectors and veterans still treasure the M1 as if it were a living thing. Its wooden stock carries the marks of 1,000 hands. Its metal bears scratches from beaches and forests, long reclaimed by peace. When fired today at commemorations or military funerals, that familiar ping still rings out, the final note of a song written in courage. Strategically, the M1 Garand's importance cannot be overstated. It gave the United States a firepower advantage unmatched by any army at the time. In every engagement, from squad-level firefights to large-scale offensives, American forces could sustain higher rates of accurate fire than their Axis counterparts. It changed how infantry tactics were written, how battles were fought, and how wars would be planned in the future. It marked the moment when individual firepower became a decisive factor in modern warfare. In the end, the M1 Garand was more than a rifle. It was the embodiment of America's industrial might, its ingenuity, and its belief in the common soldier. It stood between tyranny and freedom, and in the hands of those who carried it, it became the voice of a generation that refused to surrender. As the years passed, John Garand himself lived quietly, never seeking fame. When asked about his creation after the war, he simply said, "I only wanted to make something that would help the boys come home." And in that simple wish, he succeeded. For every soldier who carried it through mud, snow, and fire, for every man who heard that last ping and reloaded because there was still more to do, the M1 Garand remains not just a weapon, but a promise kept.